I am Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and I'll introduce today's speaker. Dr. Dana Prodoehl received her PhD in American Literature in 2008 from Marquette University and joined the faculty of UW-Whitewater in 2011. Her areas of interest and expertise are African American literature and representations of race in American literature. She traces these areas back to her upbringing in the historically and racially complex Eastern Shore of Maryland, the birthplace of such figures as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. A second route is her undergraduate training in history and involvement in archaeological digs of regional slave quarters. Welcome, Dana Prodoehl.
Thank you so much for that intro, Carrie. And I'm super excited to be with all of you and sharing my interests. I'm wildly excited about this stuff. So I tend to be a mover, so I'm sorry if I kind of confuse you or make you kind of look around the room. But I'm really excited about talking today with you about my interests in a novel of the 19th century and then tracing that into the 20th century. So my talk is called Revisiting Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 20th Century. And just in case for those folks who just came in, there's a handout going around. I think there's some copies back at the back there. One side is a kind of a character synopsis with some really key components or moments out of the text of Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's Stowe's text from 1852. And I might say 1952, so it's really 1852. I'm not making you kind of go forward 100 years. The backside of that is some information about Uncle Tom's Children, which is a book written by Richard Wright in 1938. So just to give you some context, you might not have read these books, and just to give you something to look at as I'm talking about the novels, or the books rather. So our story does start with Stowe's book in 1852, but we have to go to 1862. And what we have in front of us is a rendering in bronze of the famous moment where Abraham Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe. So the character on the right, the tall, lanky guy, that's of course Lincoln, right? On the right here, or on the left, we have Harriet Beecher Stowe looking much shorter and looking up at President Lincoln. So there's this wonderful story that folks tell about the two of these characters. And supposedly, in 1862, after meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, or upon meeting her, Lincoln says, something like, so you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. There are different variations. Some folks say, you're the lady that started this big war, right? So they all trace sort of Stowe's influence in the Civil War back to this historical moment. Well, sadly, complete poppycock. Lincoln did meet Stowe, and they probably exchanged words, more of like a nice to meet you, President, I'm Harriet Beecher Stowe. But he never said this to her. It was an anecdote concocted by her son and then promulgated by her daughter after her death to get interest back in Stowe as a character. So this really never happened. They met, yes, but this idea of her starting the war is complete poppycock. But I think what this shows, other than it being a kind of a made-up story, it shows the influence maybe socially that she had, that people thought this was true because it was such a really important book. So we can start our conversation there. So in 1852, she publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's also called Life Among the Lowly. Now this is a really interesting cover. So this was not the first cover of the novel. This was one that was kind of made at the second edition of the book. And you see a couple of really interesting things. It reads almost like an advertisement. It looks like a newspaper print rather than a book cover. And a couple things stand out. This right down here, it says 245,000 copies already published in America. The book was huge. And this is a second printing where the publisher, Jewett, is trying to get people interested in this book. And he also says things like, an edition for the million, making people feel like if you don't read it now, you're not going to, because this book's going to be a hot seller. So there really was a sense that this book was important, and Stowe and Jewett wanted the book to be read, and they were trying to get people to read it, which they didn't really have to do because the book had an incredibly huge readership. It's published beginning in 1851 as a serial, or almost like daytime TV where you've got one episode, a week later a second episode. That's how this book started to be written. So it was written in serial form starting in 1851, and about 41 kind of pieces into it, Jewett came to her and said, let's make this into a novel. She was suspicious at first, thinking that no one would read it in that kind of form. But he convinced her, and she set about to write this in a 2-volume published book. It started as a serial in the abolitionist periodical of the National Era, but a year later becomes a 2-volume novel. Upon that publication in 1852, it gains fairly immediate notoriety. A, because people already had been reading some of it in that abolitionist periodical, but two, it really kind of agitated readers because of what this novel is about, which is about slavery. So its notoriety came out in 3 different threads, if you will. Some readers thought the novel was spot on, and we assumed these to be anti-slavery folks, saying, yes, this book about slavery shows our true story. Finally, we have the story of the slave, no longer the story of the slave owner. We had another group, we assumed to be anti-slavery as well, who said, this is a good start, doesn't go far enough. So people were talking about if this book was enough to get people thinking about how slavery should be ended. And there was this third group, let's call them the slave owners, who thought the book was complete hogwash, made up. How dare Stowe write a story that's so fallacious when I treat my slaves well? How dare she write this book? So we've got these 3 groups all talking about the book. And have we heard that, that sort of maxim in the advertising world, all press is good press? Well, this spurred lots of people to read this book because so many people were talking about it, both for its good pieces being spot on and for its problematic pieces like folks thinking it's complete hogwash. So this is a book or a cover of the 2006 edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. One of the things I don't have in my slides, one thing I can talk about now just to sort of orient you, is I teach freshman literature and kind of undergraduate literature classes, and someone always asks, Dr. P, because that's what they call me because no one can say Prodoehl, Dr. P, why is literature literature? And that's a really good question, right? And one thing I say to them is that, well, there has to be a longevity. We don't just read literature in the spur of the moment and it doesn't have a sort of life beyond that moment. We read literature as it sort of appears in different variations and different decades. So a book is really judged valuable if it kind of stands a test of time. So where I'm going with this is that this is a 2006 edition. There have been more than 2 dozen different editions of this book, and that shows that it's worth something because it keeps being edited, keeps being republished, keeps being redone in different ways. So this is a 2006 edition of the book, put out by a really famous black scholar, Henry Louis Gates, who's at Harvard. In fact, kind of a nerdy sidebar, I spent last year's spring break stalking him at Harvard because I wanted to meet him so badly. He wasn't there. He was on some sort of fancy sabbatical to Africa or something. But I was there on my spring break. My students were very impressed, by the way. They were not at all. Like, that's the nerdiest thing ever, Dr. P. So he's a fairly famous black scholar at Harvard. And the interesting thing about this novel is that, and we'll talk about this later in the talk, but it does a couple of things to kind of reify or to restructure and sort of reorient a viewership to Uncle Tom's Cabin as a story of slaves. So we have in the center here, and this is an actual illustration from the first printing of the novel, we have a picture of what appears to be a slave family. And I'm sorry if it's small for those folks in the back. I thought this was huge on my laptop, but seeing it now, it's kind of tiny. We have a female slave, maybe a mother. We have some children. They all seem fairly happy. This little guy has a fishing pole, and they're maybe heading out to the fishing pond. And in each of the corners, you have different vignettes from the book, different scenes or tableaus from the book. And the most important one, right up here, it is kind of hard to see, but right up there, it's a picture of Uncle Tom and Eva St. Clair, who we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. And that's a really interesting kind of choice on Henry Louis Gates's part to say there is some value to this book. It is a piece of American history. Some folks see it as racist and problematic, and we'll talk about that. You bet your bottom dollar. But some folks like Gates are saying, well, maybe it says something about our culture that we have to give respect to or pay homage to. So we've got some primary characters in the novel, and those are on the handout. We'll talk about these a little bit. We'll talk about its contemporary reception, by which I mean the reception it got at the time of publication, so 1852. We'll talk about a modern critical reception, so how folks like me see the novel 100 plus years after. 150, oy, We're getting up there in age here, book. And last, we'll talk about the influence of the novel on society. And I mean that as being Stowe's day, but maybe also our day as well, kind of how we see this book and how it resonates with us. So in terms of its primary characters, just go through all 4 of these. There are 4 main ones, and those are on your handout. Tom, who is the character who is referenced in the title of the book, he is a slave on the plantation of the Shelbys when the book begins. Another slave that is on that slave plantation is Eliza, the tragic mulatto. Eva is a young daughter of Tom's second slave owner. And Simon Legree is Tom's last slave owner, who is such a brutal man that he actually kills Tom. So, and we'll talk about that. I'm sorry if I spoil the novel for anybody. Yeah, sorry, Tom dies. And he has to because he's a martyr, right? He's for his cause. He's a Christian character. He's got to die, sadly, if this book is going to mean anything to us. So in terms of their plot lines, Tom is the eponymous character of the book. He is sold by the Shelbys because Mr. Shelby, the slave owner, needs to make some money to pay off some debts. And they don't want to see Tom go because Tom's really important to them, but they know because of that he can fetch more money. So they send Tom, they sell him downriver, which is a real thing, going down Mississippi to other plantations. And Eliza, she is a housemaid. She's the tragic mulatto because she's a mixed race woman and she's very light-skinned. And because of that, she's called the tragic mulatto because she has all the sort of privileges of whiteness. She's beautiful, she lives in the house with the rest of the family, but she's tragic because she's not like them. She's still a slave. No matter how much better she's treated than the field slaves, she's still a slave, right? So she has the sort of pinnings or trappings of white America, but she can't really enjoy those privileges. So Eliza's young son, Harry, who is also a valuable young slave, Harry and Tom are both going to be sold. And Eliza gets wind that her son Harry will be sold, and she absconds with him. Says, I am going to fly to the north, try to get free because I'm not letting my son be sold away from me. So Tom and Eliza are 2 of the most important characters because we see the sort of impact slavery has on them in terms of their family and how they're hunted down. Eliza, we have to keep in mind, too, that 1850 is the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. So, of course, Stowe is making some reference to that by having this really beautiful, powerful, smart, witty, wonderful woman have to flee with her son as a fugitive slave. So the story follows mostly Tom and Eliza and their sort of different journeys to freedom. Eva is a really important character because she's the one who, in some way, allows Tom to have a better existence. So Tom is aboard the steamboat being sent downriver, and the St. Clair family, of whom Eva is the daughter of the St. Clair family, they're on board the ship as well. And Eva, playing around as kids do, she falls over the side of the steamboat, and of course Tom is there as her hero, jumps overboard, saves her, and Mr. St. Clair is so happy he decides to buy Tom and give him a good life. Eva's also an important character because she is the voice of Christian reason. She's a very faithful, very reverent, very intelligent, very grounded in Christianity little girl. And she kind of stands as the voice of Christian reason. So when we get this anti-slavery polemic or argument through Stowe, it's really voiced through Eva as this young girl who is innocent, but also incredibly knowledgeable about the world at the same time that she's innocent. So those are 3 of the primary characters. And Simon Legree, the dreaded Simon Legree, comes into the end of the novel. He buys Tom from the St. Clair family after the St. Clairs go through some sort of family trauma where they can't keep Tom anymore, and he is evil incarnate. He's a brutal, awful slave owner. So Tom has had a good life for a slave up until this moment. Legree sort of puts him through his paces. And I have a scene on the front page, the Uncle Tom's Cabin page. It's the second excerpt here that shows you the brutality of Simon Legree, but also the sort of Christian reverence of someone like Uncle Tom. So this second excerpt, it starts because Tom has committed some sort of transgression against his slave master. And the slave master is whipping him, pretty much saying, if you don't repent, if you don't tell me what you did wrong and say you're sorry to me, I will keep beating you until you're dead. He says something like, I will beat you until there are no drops of blood left and I can count the drops on the ground. Something horrible. I mean, something very, very ugly. And this is Tom's response. So rather than, I think in my position, I would say, I'll tell you anything you want to know, just stop whipping me. Tom says instead, And I have the full excerpt. Let me read the full one for you so you can get a sense of what he's actually saying. I didn't want to use too much space for the text here. So page 358. So as Legree is whipping him, Tom looks up. Master, if you was sick or in trouble or dying and I could save ye, I'd give ye my heart's blood. Pretty much saying there's no need to take it, I'd give it to you. I am that good of a person. I am that much of a solid Christian. I'm going to not only forgive you your wrongs against me, I'm going to give you my life's blood to save you. Pretty selfless guy. And if taking every drop of blood in this poor old body would save your precious soul, I'd give him freely, as the Lord gave his for me. Oh, Master, don't bring this great sin on your soul. It will hurt you more than 'twill me. Do the worst you can, my troubles will soon be over, but if ye don't repent, yours will never end. This is one of the most poignant moments of the novel, and people pick this up as both in some ways laughable, which we might talk about a little bit later, but a symbol of Tom's righteousness and how this is so anti-slavery because you have a slave who is one of the best people you could imagine, and he is being victimized. So it's a really clear polemic or argument against slavery here because of the way that he interacts with and forgives his, not only tormentor, his murderer at the end of his life. So in terms of its contemporary reception, I referenced a couple of slides ago that advertisement where it says 245,000 copies sold, get yours now before they're sold out. In the first year it was printed, it went through 300,000 copies. So 300,000 at least Americans in 1852 were reading this book. That's huge. Doesn't seem like big to kind of our numbers when you have like multi-million bestseller books. But if you think about the population of America at this time being smaller and the lesser number of literate Americans reading, this is a really huge number. So we know that people were passing this book around, people were talking about it, everyone read this book in some way or at least talked about it. It was the highest grossing or highest selling novel in the 19th century and the best selling book second only to the Bible. So of the entire 19th century, people were reading this book. Very, very, very popular book. Of course, as we can imagine, however, not everybody was yay, go, Stowe, right? So Southern slave owners, particularly, and those folks who were pro-slavery, had some violent responses to the novel. Stowe was sent multiple death threats, including a horrendous little package with a severed ear of a slave as a warning. If you don't stop this, I'm going to send more slave body parts to you. I mean, how horrendous is that? So she had mail sent to her. But we also hear stories of booksellers in the South being run out of town for even attempting to sell the book. So anytime the book got brought up in the sort of business of a bookseller, if you were going to sell the book, you were destined to be run out of town and maybe even worse done to you. So we see this book really agitating people in the South particularly. Interestingly, the book, both people who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery, so folks who liked what Stowe was doing and didn't like what Stowe was doing, questioned the honesty of the book. And we can imagine why, right? Pro-slavery folks saying, well, this book isn't true, so why are we putting so much, weight in it? Anti-slavery folks saying, if this is our rallying cry, it better sure as hell be right, because we can't build our entire argument around a false, fallacious, made-up story, right? So people were really concerned about whether or not this book was true, because Stowe never went to a plantation that we know of. She doesn't have, sorry, I feel like am I doing feedback there? I felt like I was echoing or something. Stowe doesn't have like a journal that she kept where she toured plantations and made notes and had character sketches. So we don't know where the information came from that she based this novel on. But we do have a sense of it because she writes in 1853 this companion book, A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she lays out the source material. It's still a bit sketchy, and I mean that quite literally. We don't know if it's a real story, but she at least attempts to say, look, this is real and here are the sources I have for it. So she really is speaking back to that concern that this is a true story and you should buy it and you should get on my side to be anti-slavery or abolitionist. In terms of modern critical reception, right, because we don't have the same reception at this historical moment that folks in 1852 did. We don't care if it's real, we don't care how many copies are selling, but folks like me who are literary scholars, we see this novel is important for two main reasons. One, it ushers in or gives us a sort of pre-definition for what we call protest literature. protest literature is a special genre of literature that comes out of a realism tradition where the literature is meant to have an argument and get people thinking about taking action to kind of follow along that argument. So these books tend to work in issues of social justice like racism and sexism, and they're attempts to get the readership to do something, not just to enjoy the story and go along for the ride, but to write letters to Congress and to have sit-ins and protests and agitate for change. This is one of the first books that does this. It's also seen as helping to define the genre of American novel as a general kind of idea. So if you think about American novels in the 1800s, they were based primarily on English or British versions of storytelling, and even the characters seemed kind of British. They were sort of higher class ladies and not lords, but ladies and gentlemen and people who were classed and had money. And Stowe kind of ushers in this idea that we can write novels about everyday life and that can still be compelling. So we see her now as being important, not just for the work she did in the abolitionist movement, but in terms of what she's doing with American literature as a genre. And then her influence on society. So in her moment, and in ours in some way, the most important influence she had on her contemporary Americans was just an exposure to slavery. So imagine yourself living in the North. Wisconsin, we are. It's hard not to when you're freezing. We're definitely in the North. You're in the North and you don't have any connection to slavery. You've never been to a plantation. You don't know any slaves, don't know any black people even. And you get this book and it shows you what slavery looks like. Well, that's a really important exposure. It gets people thinking about, oh, how does slavery look and why should I care? And are these people really human? Should we be exploiting them? It gets all these kind of questions going. So it exposes slavery to folks who didn't maybe have exposure before. The second thing it does, and this is kind of one of the, I don't want to say negative or bad repercussions of the novel, but one of the things we certainly talk about still is how it popularizes racial stereotypes. And the most important or the most famous one being, of course, the idea of the Uncle Tom. Has anyone heard this phrase before? The Uncle Tom? Do you have a sense of what it is? Anybody feel like, oh, please.
A person who's trying to be more white than he is black.
Yes. Fantastic. So it tends to be an older African-American man, and they tend to be kowtowy, and acting kind of white. I feel like I'm echoing again. Just let me know, just warn me, just no, give me some no hands if I go too far to the place where I'm echoing. So it's an older African-American man who tends to be seen as giving too much power and acting white. So getting rid of his own sense of race and his own sense of identity in favor of what the white folks want from him. So perfect. So we had this image of the Uncle Tom, and this is something that's carried on through from Stowe's day into our day. The other kind of ugly racial stereotyping of the novel are characters like Topsy. This is Topsy, T-O-P-S-Y. I'm sorry her name got cut off at the bottom there. Topsy is another slave on the St. Clair's plantation. And she is seen as, I don't want to say animalistic because it's not animalism, but she's seen as a more base creature. And if you look at how she's characterized here, this is one of the illustrations from the novel. This is not an artistic rendering from the 2010 sort of anti-slavery or anti-racism sort of movement. This is a kind of a primary text representation of her. She's incredibly dark-skinned. Which is, again, showing how she is lesser than, because if we think back to Eliza is so much prized because she's lighter skinned. So Topsy is someone who's seen as even further down the rung than someone like Eliza. The other thing that's problematic with her is kind of her mannerisms. She seems to be incredibly happy on the plantation, right? She has this grotesque body movement, but she's dancing. There are two guys behind her. This guy on the left side playing banjo, guy on the right back there playing guitar, and she's dancing along, having a good old time. It's maybe hard to see, but she's also smiling. Maybe it looks like she's singing along. So this is not the picture of a abused slave. We don't see whip marks. We don't see even her looking sad to be there. So some people saw this novel as problematic, even if they were anti-slavery too. It's problematic because it shows an image of the African slave that kind of plays into racial stereotyping, that if you can imagine pro-slavery folks saying, why would I trust her to be her own person and to vote and to make her own living? She can barely dress herself. And she doesn't understand that she's a slave. why would we make her have her own rights? She can't even take care of herself, right? So you can see the sort of images being used problematically to argue the sort of representations of race that are either good or bad. Now, the other side of that representation, of course, is that, well, but she's innocent. And people like this deserve rights too because there's an innocence about her. And clearly she's not well taken care of, no shoes, a ripped dress, and she looks a bit crazy. So let's bring her into a fold, take care of her in a humane way, and not make her be what looks like a performing animal. Right? So these images are really important to get people thinking about what slavery does. And they have lasting impressions on us. They have lasting sort of implications for race in the 19th and 20th and now 21st centuries. Okay, so that gets me to the Civil War, because we're all here to talk about Lincoln, right? So what's the connection? The connections are rather tenuous, to be quite honest with you. But if we look at kind of Lincoln's historical moment and what's happening socially and culturally and intellectually wise about these arguments around slavery, images like this have got to make a difference because people are seeing them and thinking about what race means and agitating with letters and with editorials to President Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, to work against slavery, to start the war that would sort of free these slaves. And of course, there are the reasons the Civil War started. I don't want to boil it down to just slavery, but that's my area of expertise, so that's what I'm going to focus on. But of course, there are other reasons for the Civil War. So connections here are fairly tenuous. Now I'll look at a couple of kind of main scholars in the field. The first connection folks are seeing is just an idea of sentimentalism. So sentimentalism as a genre, as a literary movement, works on emotions. If I can make you care about the characters, I can make you want to see them as free, and I can make you make a move to write your congressman to get that person free. So you're really working on people's emotions here. That's, of course, one of the primary connections. The second goes back to both Topsy and Uncle Tom and the character of the Mammy, this idea of racial stereotyping. You can imagine that if you saw images like this, that would solidify your pro or anti-slavery ideas because you're now being shown reasons why you're right, reasons why she is an animal, or reasons why she is human. So we get this stereotyping that works their way into conversations and thinking about race in America around this time of the Civil War. In terms of Lincoln specifically, we do know that Lincoln and Stowe did meet, although we don't, he didn't say that you started the war, so good job, Stowe. But Stowe is really well known for pretty much the decade and a half leading up to the Civil War because she wrote lots and lots in the press. She wrote editorials and columns and letters to congressmen and to the president, kind of advocating for an anti-slavery kind of argument. Catherine Kane in 2012 does a lot to link Stowe to Lincoln in her work. So a really interesting character. Catherine Kane writes for the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, which is an online resource out of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Hartford, Connecticut. So a really interesting woman to take a look at if you like this kind of connection between Lincoln and Stowe. So Lincoln surely knew who Stowe was, and he surely was reading the things she was writing. Now the book itself, we don't know for sure. There's no smoking gun or smoking reading glasses. It's a bad metaphor. We don't know for sure that he read Stowe, but we have a darn good idea that he did because of how widespread the novel was. If everyone is reading it, you're sure as heck going to have the president reading it too, right? He's a fairly a well-educated, well-read guy. He will have read the same stuff everyone else is reading. And in 2007, Richard Bray puts together this list, What Abraham Lincoln Read, an evaluative and annotated list, where he goes through Lincoln's journals and Lincoln's speeches and Lincoln's conversations and letters and looks at what books he's referencing. Stowe never got referenced point blank explicitly, but he was talking about similar issues as what Stowe was talking about. So Richard Bray really does think that Lincoln did read Stowe and did read this novel. Okay. So we're going to jump forward about 40 or so years into the 20th century, because this is where Stowe really starts to gain some traction. So between the end of the Civil War and her death in 1896, her book wasn't that much read anymore. It wasn't like people were reading it as a kind of a bestseller. It kind of fell out of favor. And what happened instead, much to Stowe's chagrin, were these things called Uncle Tom plays or Tom plays, these really horrific, racial, racist minstrelry shows where you'd have actors in blackface playing Uncle Tom characters and poking fun at black culture and black people. And Stowe is, of course, mortified by this because she wrote something from her heart, anti-slavery piece, and folks in the kind of late 1800s, early 1900s picked it up and said, let's make fun of this. So, but we have a kind of a resurgence of Stowe in the early part of the 20th century. After this falling out, particularly 20th century African-American authors who were interested in tracing black culture and black stories started resurrecting some of these pieces like Stowe's. And here are a couple of the most important characters who were kind of involved in this resurrection. Chester Himes, who is a fairly prolific protest author, black author of the 1930s and 40s. He and Ralph Ellison both take to task the image of the Uncle Tom specifically. And in 1943, Chester Himes writes this short story, Heaven Has Changed, where he literally has his main character dismantling a statue of Uncle Tom. So if we imagine back, was it 2006, when the troops dismantled the Saddam Hussein statue, it was that same idea. Like, let's take this thing apart so it loses power. So Himes distinctly kind of dismantles the image. In Ellison's Invisible Man in 1952, he talks around the idea of Uncle Tom and starts metaphorically dismantling it, saying this thing is no longer important. We have different versions of American life and different variations of American life, especially black male American life, and this figure no longer holds weight for us. So those two were incredibly kind of powerful in changing the ideas about what the Uncle Tom figure was. Even more strong, we have James Baldwin, who writes in 1949, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very bad novel in which sentimentality is not the locus or the center of transformative cultural power, but rather the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel, and the signal of secret and violent inhumanity. I'm going to pass this version of Uncle Tom's Cabin around. The first red tab is Baldwin's essay where he talks, where he uses these exact words. It's called Everybody's Protest Novel. The second tab is a really well-known feminist scholar who looks at the importance of the book in terms of its kind of feminism and its women rights sort of role. So it passes around just so you can take a look if you'd like. I'll buy this beer. Baldwin, he was really strongly against this novel. And if you look at his language, he's actually taking to task Stowe more so than the novel, right? So he's not just saying the novel's bad. He's also claiming that she has the mark of dishonesty, and she is the signal of secret and violent inhumanity. So folks like Baldwin really found Stowe problematic because they blamed her for creating these racial stereotypes and for promulgating them and putting them forward kind of in history. So folks like Baldwin were really angry at folks like Stowe for creating these characters. So he is a strong character here. We have one weird holdout. Has anyone heard of Langston Hughes before? It's a really famous essayist and poet of the Harlem Renaissance. And because of this, we imagine him to also have a problem with Stowe's characterizations of Black America, but he doesn't. In 1952, he writes he edits an illustrated version of the book. So he writes introductory material and he edits and puts together some essays that go along with it. And he says about the book, and this really got like under the skin of folks like Baldwin, Ellison, Himes, right? He writes, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a good story, exciting in incident, sharp in characterization, and threaded with humor. Well, to be fair to Hughes, the guy's not wrong. The book did have all of this because why else would people be reading it, right? A good story. It's the most action-packed book of the, not really, but it's very action-packed in the 1850s. You've got runaway slaves and beautiful mulattoes and babies being saved by their parents and people dying and Uncle Tom dying at the hands of Legree. It is an active book. It did have a darned good story to it, so he's not wrong. Exciting incident. Well, heck, I'm getting excited just thinking about it with the runaway slave and Uncle Tom and the falling in the river and all these exciting incidents. Again, Hughes isn't wrong. Sharp in characterization. This is where I think that people don't give Hughes enough credit. Hughes is an amazing user and purveyor and creator of language. He knows how to use language. When you say something is sharp in characterization, sharp has two main usages. Well, more than that, but two that are useful here. One, distinct, explicit, clear. Two, painful. If you've ever had a shot, right? It's a sharp needle, it doesn't feel too good. So I think Hughes is at once saying, yes, the characters are sharp. And if they weren't sharp, we wouldn't care about them because we have to understand the characters to care about the characters. Secondly, though, Hughes is suggesting here, it stings. The characters definitely sting. But we have to pay homage to this book as getting us talking about slavery, right? So he's trying to sort of play this middle field where, yes, the characterizations are sharp, they're painful, but it's a good story that got people talking. And this is maybe not the worst thing. He also calls it threaded with humor. And again, he's right there. The book is very humorous. Not the scenes of kind of brutality, that's not funny. But there are moments where the characters have light moments with each other that tend to be humorous. But, only one T there. It's a joke for my students, see if anyone's listening. No, I snickered at that one. So this guy is really why we're here. Now, no, that's not Lincoln. No, that's not Stowe. Someone who is more kind of our time period. So this is Richard Wright, who is a fairly famous author, black author of the 40s, 50s, 60s. And he writes a response to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we're going to talk about kind of next. So Wright, much like Baldwin and Ellison and Himes, he sees the influence of Stowe's work as keeping black Americans from civil rights, not leading them towards civil rights. And again, we're thinking about, in Wright's mind, he's coming from a 1920s, 1930s kind of social experience where he understands the ramifications of race in America. He has lived through Jim Crow. He's lived through Jim Crow in the South. He definitely knows what he's talking about here. Whoops. Uh-oh. Hold on. I'll be right with you. I hit the wrong button. Phew, that could have been disastrous. I'm no technologist by any stretch of the imagination, so I'll stop futzing with the button over here. Some people are, not me, sadly. I am like in the 1850s. Give me a landline and no computers and I'm good. Wright saw the influence of Stowe's work as keeping them from civil rights, not leading them towards civil rights, so he sees Stowe as being really important toward this kind of civil rights conversation. And in 1930, he writes Uncle Tom's Children, which is his attempt to revise the narrative put forth by Stowe. I'll send this one around. This is a copy, a fairly contemporary version of the book Uncle Tom's Children. Just again, peruse if you'd like. I really like visual culture, and if we think about book production, books really kind of, they had a sort of cachet in society because of how they looked. And you can judge a book by its cover, right? That's how we know if a book looks good or not. So just in terms of what Wright's doing kind of via Uncle Tom's Cabin, when we have the covers of these books, and these are all different editions of Uncle Tom's Children, the one at the top here, the red and gold, that's from 1938. That's the first edition by Harper. The one in the middle here is from 1965. It's the Perennial edition. And the one towards the bottom, which is the one that it's going around, is the 2008 edition when Harper and Perennial merged and reissued this book. So interesting. I want to talk about the covers a little bit because they give us a sense of what Richard Wright might be trying to do. If we see this version, there's no picture of Richard Wright. There's no illustration of a character. There's no visual connection between what the story is trying to say and what Wright wants the readership to get out of the story. This is a really interesting cover because it's kind of relying on Wright's reputation as a writer to get people interested in reading it. It looks very scholarly, very academic, where he's trying to say, I'm telling the real story of slavery, the real story of race in America. I don't need any jazzy covers to do that because this is a story that's worthwhile just in its own. We don't need pictures and sort of, all the doodads that are seen on book covers normally. 1965, though, when we have the sort of resurgence of interest in black folk art and black culture, we have a different cover being given to us that even sends the agenda that he had to begin with kind of in stark relief. So you've got this family. It's rather hard to see, I apologize. You've got a father here, a mother here, 2 children, and the folks in the background. And it's an image very much out of Uncle Tom's Cabin where families were broken apart because part was sold in one plantation, a kid was sold somewhere else. You know, these different families sort of being torn apart. So you've got this representation here where you've got the kind of father or male figure. He's holding the hands of 2 other people who are kind of out of the screen, kind of almost like he doesn't want to let go of them. It's a really poignant kind of image of African American life in Stowe's day, but also in 1965. And then the last cover, the 2008 cover, is even more interesting because as it's coming around, you'll see kind of this a little bit closer. But the cover is devoid of emotion in the way that this one is, but it has a figure, unlike that one. This is a young black male, we assume, with his back to us in a white tank top. He's looking at a very sort of sterile landscape. There's sort of a falling down house there. There's no grass, just sort of like these little scrubs of bushes here and there. And it really is meant to signify, he looks modern, right? This looks like a modern outfit. Signify the impact that Stowe's work has on folks in 2008. That the sort of lack of confidence we see in young black men specifically, the editors here want to say that can be traced to Stowe. The way that she popularizes racial stereotypes and makes race be a joke, if we think about those Uncle Tom plays, then this character is surely one of the children of those stereotypes. Right? So we have these three different versions of the book showing just how important Wright's work is, but also how it's based on Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Uncle Tom's Children in 1938, give you a quick synopsis, and this is on the other side of your handout, the back side. So when it was first published, it had just 4 pieces. It was published with Big Boy Leaves Home, Down by the Riverside, Long Black Song, and Fire and Cloud. In 1940, when they sort of fleshed in the book and needed some more information to sort of get the book going, they added The Ethics of Living Jim Crow, which is an autobiographical essay by Wright about his experiences in Arkansas as a young black man and what he experienced in terms of racism and discrimination and Jim Crow politics. And then the other thing was added was Brighton Morning Star in 1940. Interesting with this one, it's not a novel. It's a series of short stories with an essay thrown in the front of it. So it doesn't even function like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a fairly clear kind of one main plot line that pulls a novel together where you follow one character. Yes, there are subplots, but we care about Uncle Tom. This book has different voices, different characters, and interestingly, none of the characters or the stories or even the essay references Uncle Tom's Cabin. So whoever has the book, if you flip to the first essay, The Ethics of Living Jim Crow, he doesn't say, now everybody, my name's Richard Wright, and you might have heard this book from Stowe. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to change the title of it to be Uncle Tom's Children. He doesn't do that. He wants you to make that connection on your own. So even the mere fact of him not referencing the book, not even mentioning it, says, on the one hand, I'm going to ignore it because it's not worth my time, but the book is called Uncle Tom's Children, Richard Wright. Of course you think it's worth your time. So in this way, he's really trying to change the story and the history and the influence of this book. The only kind of subtle reference we have is in Long Black Song. The female character, Sarah, her husband's gone for the day. Maybe he's in the field or he's in town or something, and she's remembering her previous lover who went off to war named Tom. That's the only character who even is reminiscent in any way of any of the characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So really kind of not even oblique references here. So what's the connection? Why do we care? Why are you here? So if we think about what's happening in literature and social movements in 1850, and then how these things get picked up in 1938 with Uncle Tom's Children, both of these books are focusing on authenticity and authority. Remember, Stowe had to write in 1853 that book, A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, to argue the veracity and the reality and the truthfulness and the honesty of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Wright does something similar. Wright cares that the black voice is authentic. Because as he takes umbrage with, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, you have different black characters, but they're all being filtered through Stowe as the narrator. And how is that really authentic? We know that Stowe never even went to a plantation, so can she really speak for black America? Well, Wright claims that he can do it better than Stowe, A, because he's black, and because he has this lifetime full of experiences that he can kind of draw upon. In doing so, he's focusing on many voices and experiences rather than the one of the Stowe piece. So he really is trying to put the story of black America into many voices and many experiences and many different figures rather than just a simple Uncle Tom of Stowe's piece. Secondly, in doing this, Wright is really attempting to revise the sort of narrative about African American men in particular, and how we see this image in Uncle Tom of the docile, complicit, kind of dutiful, humble slave. He does this most clearly in the short story Down by the Riverside, which I can't not think of that. Gonna lay down by something and down by. Anyway, I'm not a very good singer, so I'll stop right there because that'd be traumatic. You'll be running out the door there. So in Down by the Riverside, the story focuses, and I have this on the back here if you want to follow along, focuses on Brother Man, who is a farmer. And it's a quite horrendous story, actually. Most of Wright's writing is because he wants to get people to care, and you have to make people go, oh, to care, right? You can't be like, oh, that's great. He wants to kind of jar people. So his stories tend to be rather jarring. So Brother Man is a farmer, and he lives in New Orleans, and they're experiencing a flood. Well, this sounds familiar, right, from a couple of years ago. And his wife is in labor, and he has to get her to the hospital. So he borrows, really steals, a boat from a neighboring farmer, and is able to get her in the boat and heading up the river, not down the river, up the river. So we're revising the narrative there, right? Tom gets sold downriver, Brother Man's taking his wife upriver. So he's heading up to the hospital to get her taken care of because she's been in labor for days and nothing's happening. And he gets stopped at a checkpoint by a bunch of white National Guard soldiers who are pretty much on the watch for chaos and looting and just trying to keep the peace during this flood. They stop him, they ask where he got the boat, and of course the whole time the wife is slowly dying, and he's like, I get my wife to the hospital, can we speed this up along? You know, can we just get going? My wife's dying. And they say, okay, we'll take you to the hospital, but afterward we're gonna take your boat. He's like, fine, cool, just get me to the hospital. So they get to the hospital and his wife passes away. His wife and the baby both die because she's been laboring for days, and the fetus was no longer viable, and they both pass away. Now, any normal human response would be tears, anguish, fear, cursing the heavens. And Farmer Man tries to have all of these emotions, but the soldiers are like, calm down. She's dead, you can't do anything for her now, just simmer down. Why don't you join us in the army and you can help us keep the peace? Does Brother Man or Farmer Man have any choice? No, of course not. This is Jim Crow era America. This is the South. He is being told by federal soldiers or federal kind of National Guard soldiers that he has to help them keep the peace. He can't say no. Is this really any different from Uncle Tom's experience not being able to say no to his slave owners? Right. So in this story, we have Wright talking about the complicity of Black America that really wasn't complicity at all. It was a lack of ability to show one's power, to hold one's power, to have one's power against the white power. So he really revised this idea that Uncle Tom is not docile because he's just having a good old time on the plantation. He's docile because of the choices he have. Right? So he can rally against and be shot down as he tries to run away, or he can make the best of it. And Wright's thinking, you know what? Let's not yell at Uncle Tom for doing what he had to do because it's still happening. We have Farmer Man who's experiencing a very similar sort of control. This is some feel-good reading, right? Just read this on the weekend. I realize how unfun this stuff is once I talk to people about, like, oh God, that really is horrible. Why do I study this? And writing things like Down by the Riverside, he's really offering this alternate history, that we have an image of slaves, we have an image of race in America, but he tries to tell true stories. He tries to alternate the sort of stories and the voices and the things being talked about in terms of race in America at this time. It's also a subtle, and that's my question mark there is I always leave things up to the reader. When I teach my students, I tell them, I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm going to give you good questions, ask good questions, and have you come up with your own answer. So this is your kind of chance to have your own answer here. I see it as a subtle argument of the adverse effects of Stowe's book, that just by calling his book Uncle Tom's Children, he is hearkening back to the idea that Stowe and what Lincoln was fighting for, that these folks have an effect on future generations. And he really is arguing that there's this prolonging of slavery, that once we were done with slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, everything was good, and like the Juneteenth issues, that really what followed that was still a period of unrest and discrimination, and that those children are still being seen. So slavery didn't end in 1865, and in some ways we could argue as a nation it's maybe still going on, not literal slavery, but discrimination, racism, all those things. And we have these kind of touchstones from 1850s America. Just a fun little thing, because I like to judge books by their covers. So if we juxtapose two books, this is 1900's Uncle Tom's Cabin, a version put out by the Chimney Corner series by Lupton in New York. And we have Uncle Tom's Children. This is a 1943 edition. Really interesting similarities. On the left, we have, this is Uncle Tom. He looks pretty happy. He's got a smile on his face. He's got his kind of loving, doesn't have a family, but these loving folks behind him. He's got his hoe. He's heading down to the field, having a grand old time. He doesn't look like he's oppressed, doesn't look sad, doesn't look like, help me. He's not giving us any sort of subliminal messages. This is one image of the black man at the time of slavery and afterward. Wright gives us a very different image of the black man experience, the black male experience during slavery and afterward. So what's interesting is just the way that these two things get shown to us. We are meant to look at Uncle Tom. He is clear, he is looking at us, there's nothing, barricading our view. On the right side, what we have here is a hole in the wood, almost like a peephole. We're not supposed to see what's happening. And we have a black male character who does not look happy. He looks like he's being traumatized. There's a little bit of a screaming sort of idea. He's scared, his eyes are wide. He's got some shotguns or rifles. I'm not a gun person. He's got some sort of gun pointed at his face here, clearly not a happy scene. He's been tied up, and we get the sense that he is on his way to join his friend who is hanging on the tree back there. So we have a very different picture of race in America, that this is the one kind of propelled forward by folks like Stowe, that we should give slaves their rights because look how happy they are, look how great they are. They're not going to take up guns against us, they're good. If we give them rights, they'll stay good. Wright says, well, if we don't take the guns will be at us, right? So we have to agitate a little bit more for our rights. Interesting aside, too, the figure in the back who is being lynched on the tree, lynchings occurred with greater number after the Civil War rather than before and during the Civil War. In fact, where I'm from in Maryland, we had our last lynching in 1952 in Salisbury, Maryland. We still have the tree with like the plaque and the commemoration, so 50 years ago. We had our last lynching. So this is not something that happened just during slavery. There's a fear that free blacks were going to take over and you had to control them. So you did that through fear, through intimidation, through the KKK, through lynchings. So this is a kind of a real, very different picture of race than what we get with someone like Stowe. Okay, so what does this mean for us? Because we're not in 1900, we're not in 1943, we're not even in 1952. Well, here's what it means. Ever heard of this book, this movie, 12 Years a Slave? Really well talked about, a big Oscar contender, really kind of well known. Does anybody know where it came from?
Yes.
What'd you got?
A book about Solomon Northup.
Yes.
He was a free black in New York State who was kidnapped into slavery. He spent 12 years in slavery and
Exactly.
he smuggled a letter out and was rescued by his friends back in New York.
Fabulous. So we have an Oscar-winning, I'm sure the Oscars are over or not, I don't follow that stuff. But we have a really well-known movie being talked about all over the place. And it's based on a book from what year? Bam! 1853. The year after Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. So we like to put things like Stowe in these historical boxes and say, well, that was the 1850s. It doesn't really matter to us anymore. But we have a movie everyone's talking about based on a book written published just a year after Stowe publishes her piece. And we have these resurgences of interest in African American life and minority stories that comes out in things like 12 Years a Slave. So it does have some influence on who we are. The last thing I have is just a list of sources, works cited, works consulted, and also I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, if you have any. I've taken you, it's like a tour de force, it's like I've taken you everywhere, but.
Okay, I'll come around with the microphone. So
Should I turn my microphone off?
Nope, you can stay on. Yep.
A couple of years ago, maybe more than that now, the scholar David Reynolds
Uh-huh.
wrote a book about Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Mm.
Do you have any comments on his approach?
No. No. I mean, there are certain books that get a lot of attention because they might be controversial or they might show a different sort of way in. But I like to take the long approach. And I like to look at this book and what it's done in terms of historical sort of conversations. And Reynolds, of course, is of course part of that conversation. So I turn around, what did you think about Reynolds? Because you seem to know this era, you knew Northup. So what do you think about Reynolds' work?
Well, I haven't read the book, and I was going to wait and see what you thought of it.
Oh, oh, read it. Yeah. I don't mean to put anybody off of that stuff.
I have read other books by him, particularly his book on John Brown.
Uh-huh.
He has been criticized by some reviewers for playing a little fast and loose with his research, maybe not being the most
Right.
careful researcher out there.
Yeah,
He made some mistakes in the John Brown book that I caught.
right.
We have time for probably
That's interesting.
one more
I-
question. What is something?
Can I add one more thing to this, though, before we move on?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
the reason why I really appreciate that question is, especially when I deal with students, they're so sort of hung up on the idea of what's true and what's not true. And I tell them, there is no truth. Christians would think the Bible is true, and that's fine. Muslims would think the Quran is true, and that's fine. But we don't have truth, right? All we have are different versions of a history, and whatever we decide is the truth, that's the truth. So someone like Reynolds, I appreciate the ways that he's trying to not change the conversations, but add wrinkles to the conversation to try to get to a more true existence. So I'm for reading anything you get your hands on to get a sense of what's really happening, because even things that are fake can still give us a sense of what the honesty might be at the bottom of that fakeness.
And there's a question here, although I think something might be wrong with the microphone. We'll try it.
Hi, I'm not sure question, or hopefully you know a little bit about theater and musicals.
I can do jazz hands.
Like
That's all I got for you.
like
Spear
the-
fingers.
The King and I.
Oh,
And how
okay.
they handled that, tried to westernize Siam, the king of Siam. And the teacher of the children and the wives of all the wives of the king and so on. And when England, the dignitaries were coming, and how they were going to show how dignified. So the hoop skirts came out and
Oh,
so on
yeah,
and so
yeah.
forth.
Yeah.
Okay, but most importantly, they were put on a little skit.
Okay.
Uncle Tommy's cabin, I think.
Oh.
Topsy, Happy Topsy.
Oh, yes.
And Simon Legree.
Uh-huh.
And so on and so forth. Could you tell us a little bit about how that was done, how it was handled, how the perception, I guess? The
Yeah.
perception
Yeah.
was very important in there. How they perceived that little skit.
Do you mean the characters in like The King and I, or
The
The historical,
different
kind of
people,
contemporary.
The English, the king, the
oh,
teacher, you know, the society,
yeah,
Siam,
yeah.
and
I can't speak for British culture or the aristocracy or Siam or the colonialists, but I can speak from an American perspective that Uncle Tom's Cabin, after the Civil War, wasn't seen as a joke per se, but it was seen as a really good story. So let's capitalize on interest in the book and in the story, especially Topsy. If we go back to, I'm not going to be able to find it, but that slide of her sort of dancing, looking crazy, that is a very kind of poignant theatrical moment. And people used caricatures like that one to sort of build these other stories around that. If we think about the 1920s and 30s as being the rise of the KKK in America, even earlier than that these stories became sort of retold as a way to joke at the freedmen. Because okay, imagine yourself in the South and you are pro-slavery, you are anti-abolition, and you are staunchly kind of Confederate kind of leaning. If you see all of these free people running around, what can you do? You can try to harass them, but you can also make fun of them in the sort of cultural marketplaces. So in terms of America, it became a sort of story to use and to make fun of and to laugh at. I can't speak for the British sensibility though, but I think it's probably something similar.
I think part of it was the king putting so much trust in this English teacher, professor, or whatever.
Yeah, she's like a
educators were
Yeah.
very respected. So
Yeah.
he was putting a lot of trust in her.
Right.
And that she was not going to let his society down. I mean, and I think
Right.
when she put on the skit, he thought she was stabbing him in the back.
Oh,
and making fun
interesting.
of his charge over his wives.
Yeah.
So on and so forth.
Interesting.
And I'm sorry
But I
that
don't think she did.
we do. We run out of time. I'm
oh
sorry
shoot!
to say.
I'm sorry I talked too
no,
much.
no. It's and
You could just
perhaps-
shut me off.
I'm going to shut this microphone off for sure. It's really bad. But
Okay.
I'd like to, I believe Dr. Prodoehl can stay for a few individual questions afterwards. But as far as the series goes today, we'll have to stop it there. And let's go ahead and thank you
Shoot.
to Dr. Prodoehl.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm only here because of you, so turn the applause back around.